right. All right, well, let's get started. This is the most fiber-packed talk I think I've ever done, especially at a hackers conference. It's hard to fill a room when you're talking about flowcharts, when we could be talking about exploits, attack methodologies, and those types of things. But it's my lot in life to go around and work with enterprise customers and fix what's broken. I am a tool vendor, so often vendors want to talk about tools. But one thing I'm finding systematically broken is the lack of process that connects it all together. So, real quick, we're going to hit on this very quickly, rapid fire, but out of this talk, I want you to be able to go back to work and fix things next week. Fix the way we talk to vendors, fix the way we talk to each other, fix the way that we actually catch and respond to breaches. And so I'm not going to try to sell you on process in this. I'm going to teach you how to do it. So here's why it's important. Vendors evaluating tools to solve problems wear out customers. We all share the exact same marketing department. We talk about tools the same way. We do analytics or behavioral analysis. And if you were here last year, I went through the academic school of thought on network behavioral anomaly detection and some of the things those do. But this year at RSA and other conferences, every vendor is talking about behavioral and anomaly detection. So it's the same. It wears on you. You can't have a real conversation because all the messages sound the same. The other problem is those that are having to execute InfoSec are having a challenge communicating with management, and management's having a difficult time communicating with executives and the board of directors on why it's important to have a specific tool, to hire specific headcount, and to make changes that are important and use a common vernacular. And the last thing is staffing skilled InfoSec folks. I started my career in InfoSec officially in 2001 when I was active duty in the military. And we were, at that point, had no one to do anything. I was actually an aircraft mechanic just a few weeks before I was just trying to catch China stealing our information. And it still is a problem. How do we train people to do advanced security issues without process? And so this is how it's supposed to look. Sorry about the color here. But policy dictates what we want to do. How should we act? What should people do? How should we do things? Process is the piece that tells us how to do that. How do we operationalize it? If we're not supposed to go to certain places on the website, how do we operate, or on the internet, how do we operationalize that? And people are supposed to execute the process that's documented, and tools are supposed to enable the people to execute the process that align with policy. But unfortunately, we've skipped the process piece. I don't sell process. I don't get paid for process. My company's not too happy that I'm up here talking about process because we can't turn a profit on that. But so we talk about tools, so much about tools and putting our faith in tools. But really the answer isn't in tools. And it's not necessarily in people if they're not connected through process. So as I meet with organizations of different shapes and sizes, I find almost categorically this is the InfoSec process. Something happens. Did our stuff catch it? If not, smart people do foo, right? We're going to use our InfoSec skill to go in there and figure it out. There's a lot of problems with this. One is it's very difficult to train and staff someone that can do foo. That's an expensive person. That orange block's very expensive. Secondly, you can't really audit it. You can't go back and figure out if they did foo correctly. And you can't gauge the success of the foo. So the reality is we need something closer to this. Man, that's an eye chart on this screen. Okay. But we break that do foo into smaller compartments. And the idea behind this is then we can start gauging how effective our different tools are at addressing areas, and our ability to execute on them. So the first thing I do, and this is my favorite part, is when I get the operators in a room. The guys that are actually doing the work, not the managers or the policy people, but the guys that receive the tickets that say there's an infection, or the people that have to review the logs. And we get them all in a room, and we focus on 2 to 3 hours. We have someone that writes down the questions or writes down the answers, bring in food or beer, and we work through it. The questions we ask, strangely, are questions that don't regularly get asked inside of organizations because we're so busy putting out fires that we don't take a step back and evaluate how we're actually operationalizing things. So things like, how do we block specific types of attacks? How do we block known malware, zero-day malware? How do we block unauthorized access? How do we block folks jumping on wireless access points? What do we currently do to address these issues? Secondly, when something gets through the blocking, if a bad packet makes it in, how do we detect that a machine becomes compromised of different types? And then really, one of the most fundamental missing pieces in InfoSec right now is how do we determine impact of an event? If we have a notification that a machine was compromised with a piece of malware, how do we go back and determine what it did while it was compromised? What machines did it communicate with? What data did it take? What was the impact to business of that infection? Unfortunately, because we don't have documented processes, the amount of time that would be required is so massive that we skip these things. And the end result is we don't learn internally what actually happened. The next piece beyond this, and this is really far beyond a lot of organizations, is the ability to do retroanalysis. We figured out what happened, who did it, what the impact was, but now we need to roll the clock back and say, okay, is this the first time this event has happened to us, or is it a systematic, ongoing problem? And the only way to do that is to take the indicators of compromise documented in the impact part and look throughout historical data for similar markers. And then lastly, how do we actually report and share the information? So we just collect that. On the detection piece, so I skipped blocking. We can go through blocking later, but how do you actually catch when malware is detected? And I met with one of the Fortune 50 companies not too long ago, and it's either AV or the help desk phone rings. That's how they detect malware. The computer's acting up. That's pathetic, but it's what it was. How do you catch 0 days? So there's no signature when it enters, the malware enters the network. But then it later, at some point, becomes known and there is a signature. How do you detect that 0 day? How do you look at indicators of compromise, things like known bad URLs, known bad patterns, bad attacks? How do you look for bad network behaviors, things like scanning the network, using onion routing, those types of things? How do you detect network anomalies? And if you want to break down on the difference between network behaviors and network anomalies, you can go to last year's deal and pull up my talk there. And then we go back and we take the logs. All these things that we did detect, we want to pull that data out. And normally I do an assessment over a 30-day period. You could do it longer. But look how many of these things did we catch. If we're catching known malware through McAfee AV, how many of those things did we catch? And so we need to put some volume numbers to this. And then same thing in response. Have an honest conversation here. How long does it take us to get an infected machine off the network and clean it? How long does it take us to determine the impact of a breach? With the tools and the process we have, how many man-hours does it take? How long does it take us to figure out mapping network communications to malware files? Retroflow analysis, looking for communications in the past that match the pattern. Same thing for file. And then document the tools. And the reason, oh, I really can't read this. So the reason we do an investigation is that we learn from an incident so that we can change the way we're doing things so it doesn't happen again. If we're not able to do that, there's no point in doing an investigation, frankly. At the top is an example, a clarified end result from an investigation that would read something like this. Host A connected to Ukrainian host B at 8 a.m. on January 1st, 2015. It downloaded and executed an unknown type of malware that was later classified as malware.abc. Upon compromise, host A began reconnaissance on the network, infected 4 other machines, collected 1.3 gig of traffic from file shares before exfiltrating into an FTP server in Eastern Europe. Retro analysis revealed that 6 other machines had been compromised on the network in a similar manner. Here's the user, and it tends to be unintentional. But if the tools aren't in place for answering those questions, this is actually very common. What we get is a very small set that's not actionable. So with that said, let me roll into what you do with this. I just tweeted, I'll give you the resources later, but you can download these Visio documents and start pasting the stuff in yourself. But for instance, how do we catch credential abuse? That's someone that uses a password, username and password, to do something they shouldn't, whether it's stealing data as an insider or a spearfish set of credentials. How many of those did our logs catch per month? Fill in on impact. How long does it take us to review the logs? And the percentage on the impact is what the probability is that we're going to catch, they're actually going to catch the data that we need, that we're going to find the evidence. If you have every log on every machine, that's a 100% metric. So real quick on the 3 phases, I like to think about the things we can block or prevent from happening. So you just count up we don't really care about how many things we did block. We care about how many things got through. And so what this is going to be are the events that we detected that we didn't block. So maybe an intrusion detection system. Maybe it's, God help you, Brian Krebs calling. But the things that passed through and we detected that weren't blocked, how many of those things happened in the monitored period? A month is what I recommend. And then detection during, or detection, you look at these different mechanisms that are catching things. How many of these things are happening? And again, this will just be, at the top, how do we catch known malware? How do we catch zero-day malware? How do we catch credential abuse? How do we catch IOCs and those types of things? And we just fill in how many of these things happen every month. And then finally, on the investigative piece, we look at how long it takes us to do something. And then once we have all those things filled in from the interview and from the log collection, we do some math. And the math's really not that complicated, but it's transformational. The number of events to investigate are pulled from the logs. And a good way to do this, if you're doing an evaluation, you call in the vendors that are always annoying you, like me or whoever, and let them put their tools in. And let them, for that 30-day period, detect everything, and you aggregate that data up. And now you have, given what the current technology can detect, we detected 100 events or 200 events or whatever it might be. And that falls into the N variable here, the total events that we would need to investigate in a monitored period, in a month, right? And then the total events would actually be the delta. So if you have a tool set and then you bring in additional tools, and those additional tools catch things that your existing tools don't catch, there's a difference between that. Often with new technologies, we might catch twice as many events than you would with traditional stuff. So that T is going to be at least as big as N. If you're detecting everything that gets detectable, it would be that. Time per investigation, you take all those green blocks. How long does it take us to do retro file analysis? How long does it take us to do retro flow analysis? And you add all those blocks up. If we were to do all of those things on every investigation, what would be the total time to do one investigation completely? And then you multiply those out and divide that by 160, which is the number of hours an FTE, a full-time employee, should have, and you have these metrics. And the reason this becomes important now, that I just bored you to tears on how to build this before telling you what you needed, is when I come in as a vendor and I want to sell you a new tool, now we have a mechanism for, one, evaluating if it's actually good for the business, and two, for having a conversation to sell it internally. And this is, frankly, the reason I came up with this, is because I wanted to show that I'm not just bringing in new features. I worked for InfoWorld magazine for about 6 years doing product testing on network security gear, and we had to do these comparative matrices, right? And this tool has this feature and this tool has this feature. But I often found when I was testing them that the devices that had less features were better. And I was trying to understand why they were better. And the end result was their ability to impact a business process. And so if you take the before picture, and by the way, these are actually real numbers from a place, if I mentioned it, you would all know them. They have 285 events per month. With their current tool set, it took them 69 hours to investigate it. So that would require 123 FTE in their incident response team. So ridiculous amount of people. Came in there with some partners who brought in some tools we thought would be effective. And bringing in that stack reduced the requisite FTE from 123 to 9. Still pretty high, so we needed to bring in some services as well. But this level is important because what you can go back to the vendor and say is, you either need to reduce, you have to reduce my number of events. That if you can find anyone that can do that, that's going to have a quick return because it's going to have an immediate impact on FTE. And the reason, and then you take this up to management and say, look, this is why we need the tool, because it's not just good for security, it's good for business. And if a vendor can't do this, you don't need the tool. The next one is talking to management. You're not saying, because what management hears when we bring in tools is the security nerds want a new toy, right? That's what they're hearing when we say, no, you don't understand, we need advanced malware sandboxing, or big data analytics, or whatever it is, right? We need those things. Well, what they're hearing is the nerds need some more tools. And so we need to raise the conversation above that. And so this block, being able to say, if we bring the tools in, we can reduce the requisite FTE from 123 to 9 in this case. We can reduce the risk to the organization. We're only catching half of things we could catch. That's a risk problem. So now instead of having a conversation around features, tools, those types of things, we're having a business level conversation. And lastly, the reason I think this is most critical to InfoSec is my first gig that I was paid for in information security was I was a network security officer for the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. And the chief of staff asked me what I needed to do that. And I said, I don't know, Captain, give me $250,000 and 7 sailors. So he did. He gave me those to go see the comptroller. Well, then I had 7 sailors that didn't know how to do anything InfoSec. And so what I found myself doing is I'm doing it all, and these guys are playing Call of Duty, right? Which was infinitely frustrating for me. So what we did is I took the things that I did, I put it out into a process, and then I would circle a portion of it. Take someone and say, you are going to take input from the previous guy, you're going to take the IP addresses, you're going to run a query, and you're going to determine every host that infected host talked to. And if on that list is something that's critical, you're going to document it, and then you're going to pass it on. And then all this guy does all day long is run these queries. Very easy to train this guy. The guy that has to do foo, much more expensive. So what ends up happening when you're doing professional development then is you bring a guy in to do flow analysis, or to do retro file analysis, or to do indicators of compromise queries. And you teach that to him, right? You build the how to do that. And then as he learns to master that, he's going to contribute back into improving that process. And then for his next phase in development, he will learn how to do the next piece. And maybe after he learns 2 or 3 parts of part of the process, he might become a manager of guys or a team lead on the guys that do this. And so you have an ability to take a guy that has acumen and aptitude, but doesn't need to have 20 years of InfoSec experience underneath their belt. So Are there any questions? Every time I do a talk on flowcharts, I know this is what the faces are going to look like. It is a very high fiber type of conversation, and some of you have beer, and I don't have one, which makes me like you less. But any questions on this? I'm going to go to the next slide. There's a resource doc on this. This is a sort of an abbreviated version of this talk, but oh, I messed up the URL. If you go to Twitter, Charles Herring, I tweeted the URL. It's not currently there, but it's just GrrCON 2015. Messed that up somehow. Anyway, use your imagination, GrrCON 2015. And you can download the deck and the Visio templates and start placing in the different numbers. But it is an effective way to have conversations with vendors, have it with managers, and train people. There's a lot of new talent here that would love to get involved in InfoSec, but feels like it's too big. And the other part about this is they're going to learn the tools to doing a specific task, right? It might be, FireEye or FireAmp or CrowdFire, whatever. There's fires everywhere. One of those tools for doing malware analysis, right? Or retrofile, and they learn that tool, and they run with that tool, and you can have someone up and running, helping the team in a very short period of time. So, any questions? Anybody? Somebody asked me one question. Oh, okay. All right, thank you very much. You have your time back.